She was 18, still untouched, and her uncle just sold her like livestock to a stranger twice her age. What you're about to hear isn't just another frontier tale. It's the story of Hannah Lee, a girl who became a commodity in a single handshake, delivered through a blizzard to a man who needed hands, not a heart. But what happened next? It shattered every expectation on that frozen Wyoming ranch. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and please drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Hannah's journey has traveled across the world. Now, let's begin. The wind that night didn't howl. It screamed. It tore across the Wyoming territory like something alive and furious, rattling the thin walls of the boarding house where Hannah Lee sat on the edge of a bed that had never truly been hers. Outside, snow fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see 3 feet past the window. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, old wood, and something else. Something sour that Hannah had learned to recognize as her uncle's particular brand of disappointment. She was 18 years old. 18 years of existing in spaces where she wasn't wanted, eating at tables where she wasn't welcome, sleeping in rooms where her breathing seemed too loud. Her parents had died of fever when she was 11, her mother first, then her father 3 days later, as if he couldn't bear to be in a world without her. Hannah had been sent to live with her mother's brother, Uncle Silas, a man whose smile had died long before his sister did. For 7 years she had made herself small, useful, quiet. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She never asked for anything. And still, it was never enough. Tonight, sitting in that cold room with her hands folded in her lap like a child awaiting punishment, Hannah knew something had shifted. Silas had been in the saloon downstairs for hours, his voice rising and falling in negotiation. She'd heard the cadence before. It was the same tone he used when selling horses or trading grain. Business, transaction, deal. But this time she understood with a cold, creeping certainty the commodity was her. The door opened without a knock. Silas entered first, his face flushed from whiskey and wind, his eyes avoiding hers with the practiced ease of a man who had long ago stopped seeing her as a person. Behind him came the stranger. Hannah's first impression was of size. The man had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, his shoulders broad beneath a heavy coat crusted with snow. He was older, maybe 35, maybe 40, the kind of age that was hard to pin down on men who worked with their hands and lived with the weather. His face was all hard lines and sharp angles, weathered by sun and cold until it looked like it had been carved from the same stone that made up the mountains. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to unclench. He looked at Hannah once, a single assessing glance that traveled from her face to her hands and back again, and then he looked away, as if he'd seen everything he needed to see. "This is her?" His voice was low, rough, like gravel underfoot. "This is Hannah." Silas gestured vaguely in her direction, as if she were a piece of furniture he was trying to move. 18, healthy, knows her way around a kitchen and can sew well enough. Not much to look at, but she's clean and she don't talk back. Hannah felt something inside her chest fold in on itself. Not much to look at. The words weren't new. She'd heard variations of them her whole life, but somehow, spoken here in front of this stranger, they carried a different weight. Final. Definitive. The man, Grant Mercer, Silas had called him, didn't respond to the assessment. He simply reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. The coins inside made a sound like distant thunder. "The agreement was $40, Grant said. "That was before I told you she's untouched," Silas countered, and Hannah felt heat flood her face, shame and rage mixing until she couldn't tell them apart. A virgin at 18? That's gotta be worth something to a man in your position. My position. Grant's voice didn't rise, but something in it made Silas take a half step back. "You mean a widower with 3 children who needs someone to keep a house from falling apart?" "I mean a man who needs a wife." "I need a housekeeper," Grant corrected, his tone flat. "Let's not dress this up as something it's not." Hannah watched them negotiate her value like she wasn't sitting 6 feet away, watched Silas push for $50, watched Grant counter with 45, watched them settle on 47 and a horse to be delivered in spring. $47 and a horse. That's what she was worth. When the money changed hands, when Silas counted it twice with fingers that shook slightly, Hannah felt something inside her go very still and very cold. It was the same feeling she'd had when her mother died, that sense of standing at the edge of something vast and dark and knowing that whether you stepped forward or stood still, the ground beneath you had already disappeared. "Get your things," Silas told her, pocketing the money without meeting her eyes. "Mr. Mercer's got a long ride ahead." Hannah had been packed for an hour. Everything she owned fit into a single canvas bag, 2 dresses, one for working and one for Sunday church she rarely attended, a shawl her mother had knitted before the fever took her, a few undergarments, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, and a small wooden box that held the only photograph she had of her parents. It wasn't much. But then, she'd never been much. She stood, picked up the bag, and followed Grant Mercer down the stairs and out into the screaming cold without saying a word. What was there to say? Silas didn't follow them out, didn't say goodbye, didn't even watch from the window. The last Hannah saw of him, he was heading back toward the saloon, his hand already reaching for the coins in his pocket. The wagon was waiting in the street, 2 horses stamping and snorting in the cold, their breath making clouds in the darkness. Grant took her bag and tossed it into the back without ceremony, then gestured toward the seat. "Can you climb up yourself?" Hannah nodded. She could. She did. The wood was so cold it burned through her skirt, and the wind cut through her cloak like it wasn't there at all. Grant swung up beside her, took the reins, and with a click of his tongue and a snap of leather, they were moving. That was it. No ceremony. No witnesses. One moment Hannah was the unwanted niece of a bitter drunk, and the next she was... what? Property? Wife? Servant? She didn't know, and the man beside her didn't seem inclined to clarify. They rode in silence. The storm made visibility almost impossible. Snow drove sideways into Hannah's face, melting on her cheeks in a way that felt like tears even though she wasn't crying. She wouldn't cry. She'd learned years ago that tears changed nothing, fixed nothing, softened nothing. They just made your face wet and your nose run and gave people something else to mock you for. So she sat up straight, kept her hands folded in her lap, and stared ahead into the wall of white as if she could see through it by sheer force of will. After what might have been an hour, time had become strange, measured only in degrees of cold and exhaustion. Grant spoke. "Ranch is about 3 hours out. Storm's going to make it longer." Hannah nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see her in the darkness. "You'll have your own room," he continued, his voice raised just enough to carry over the wind. "Separate from mine. You'll cook, clean, and look after the children. In return, you'll have a roof, food, and clothing as needed. Those are the terms." Those are the terms. As if this were a job she'd applied for. As if she'd had a choice in any of it. "I understand," Hannah said, because what else was there to say? Grant glanced at her then, the first real look he'd given her since that initial assessment in the boarding house room. "You speak. When spoken to." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, a little flash of the anger she kept buried deep. But Grant just nodded, something that might have been approval flickering across his face before the storm swallowed it. They didn't speak again for a long time. The journey was brutal. The cold worked its way through every layer of clothing Hannah wore, settling into her bones until she couldn't remember what warmth felt like. Her fingers went numb first, then her toes, then her face. She tucked her hands under her arms and hunched forward, trying to make herself smaller, trying to conserve whatever heat she had left. At some point, she wasn't sure when, she started to drift. Not sleeping exactly, but not fully awake either. A strange twilight state where the line between the storm outside and the storm inside her head blurred and mixed until she couldn't tell them apart. She thought about her mother, about the last thing her mother had said to her before the fever took her ability to speak. "Be brave, little bird. Be braver than I was." Hannah had never understood what that meant. Her mother had seemed plenty brave, brave enough to marry for love instead of security, brave enough to have a child even though the doctors said it might kill her, brave enough to laugh in the face of a hard life. But maybe her mother had seen something Hannah couldn't. Maybe she'd known that the real bravery wasn't in the big moments, the births and deaths and declarations, but in the small daily act of continuing to exist in a world that kept trying to erase you. We're here. Grant's voice pulled Hannah back to herself. She blinked, trying to focus, and realized the storm had lessened slightly. Through the snow, she could make out the dark shape of buildings. A house, a barn, a few smaller structures she couldn't identify. The Mercer Ranch. Her new home. The word felt wrong in her mouth, like something that didn't belong to her and never would. Grant pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned to her, and in the faint light coming from the windows, Hannah saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a hard face, yes, but there was something else there too, something that looked like exhaustion so deep it had worn grooves into his features. "My children," he said slowly, as if choosing each word with care, "have been through enough. They don't need complications. They don't need drama. They need stability. Can you give them that?" Hannah met his eyes. "I don't know what I can give them, Mr. Mercer, but I can promise I won't make things worse." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. He nodded once, sharp and final. "That'll do." He climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side, reaching up to help her down. Hannah hesitated for just a moment. This was the first time he'd touched her. The first time any man had touched her beyond a handshake or an accidental brush in a crowded room. But then she took his hand because what choice did she have? His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong but not crushing. He lowered her to the ground with surprising gentleness, then released her immediately and stepped back, as if touching her for even a second longer than necessary would violate some unspoken rule. "Come on," he said, grabbing her bag from the wagon. "Let's get you inside before you freeze to death." The front door opened before they reached it. A boy stood in the entrance, 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that looked too old for his face. He stared at Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. Wary, guarded. The look of someone who'd been hurt and had no intention of letting it happen again. "Lucas," Grant said, "this is Hannah. She'll be staying with us." "Hannah, this is my oldest, Lucas." The boy said nothing, just looked at her with those ancient eyes, and then stepped aside to let them enter. The house was warm, blessedly warm, and for a moment that was all Hannah could focus on. Heat from a potbelly stove in the corner, the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. She stood just inside the door, dripping snowmelt onto the wooden floor, and tried to take it all in. It was a simple house, one large main room that served as kitchen, dining, and living space, with a few doors leading off to what she assumed were bedrooms. Rough-hewn furniture that had been well made once but showed years of hard use. Dishes stacked by a basin, laundry hanging on a line strung across one corner. Everything functional, nothing decorative. A house, Hannah thought, but not a home. Not anymore. "Papa?" The voice was small, uncertain. Hannah turned and saw a little girl peering around one of the door frames, maybe 6 years old, with tangled blonde hair and a nightgown that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric had been. "It's all right, Jonah," Grant said, his voice gentling in a way Hannah hadn't heard before. "Come say hello." The girl, Jonah, crept into the room like a wild animal approaching a trap. She kept one hand on the doorframe, ready to bolt, and stared at Hannah with eyes the same color as her father's. "Hello, Jonah," Hannah said quietly. "I'm Hannah." The girl said nothing, just stared. "There's one more," Grant said. "Becky? She's 3, already asleep upstairs." 3 children. 3 motherless children in a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Hannah felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't just about cooking and cleaning. This wasn't just about keeping a house running. This was about 3 small people who had lost their mother and had learned not to trust anything good that came through their door. "Your room is through there," Grant said, pointing to one of the doors. It was... He stopped, swallowed. "It's clean. There's a bed and a chest for your things. We eat at dawn, noon, and dusk. Breakfast is usually porridge or eggs. Lunch is cold. Dinner is whatever you can make from what's in the cellar." He was speaking quickly now, listing facts like armor, keeping distance between them with information and instruction. "The children have chores. Lucas handles the chickens and helps me in the barn. Jonah feeds the dogs and collects kindling. Becky is too young for much, but she can set spoons on the table. They're good kids. They'll listen to you if you're fair." "And if I'm not fair?" Hannah asked, surprising herself. Grant looked at her sharply. "Then they'll make your life hell, and I won't stop them." It was the most honest thing he'd said all night. "Fair," Hannah repeated. "I can do fair." "Good." He set her bag down by the door to what was apparently her room. "There's a basin and pitcher in there for washing. Privy is out back, 30 paces straight from the back door. Don't go out in the dark without the lantern. Easy to lose your way in the snow." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Welcome to the Mercer Ranch, Hannah Lee." It didn't sound like a welcome. It sounded like a warning. Then he turned and walked toward one of the other doors, his room, she assumed, and disappeared inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded like the final seal on a contract. Hannah stood in the main room, still dripping, still cold despite the warmth of the stove. Lucas had disappeared too, melting back into whatever shadows children vanished into when adults weren't looking. Only Jonah remained, still clutching the doorframe, still staring. "Good night, Jonah," Hannah said softly. The little girl blinked once, twice. Then without a word she turned and fled, her bare feet making small padding sounds on the wooden floor. Alone now, Hannah picked up her bag and pushed open the door to her room. It was small, a bed with a thin mattress and blankets that had been folded with military precision, a chest at the foot of the bed, a small table with a basin and pitcher, as promised, a single window with shutters closed against the storm. Nothing else. No decorations. No personal touches. No sign that anyone had ever lived here at all. It was, Grant had started to say, started to explain, and then stopped. Whose room had this been? Hannah set her bag on the chest and sat down on the bed. The mattress creaked under her weight, a sound like a question she didn't know how to answer. She thought about taking off her wet clothes, washing, changing, but she couldn't seem to move, couldn't seem to do anything but sit there in her damp dress and stare at the wall and try to understand what had just happened to her life. She'd been sold, delivered, dropped into a house full of grief and silence and children who looked at her like she was something dangerous. And the worst part, the part that made her throat tight and her eyes burn, was that she had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no friends to take her in, no money to start fresh somewhere else. This was it. This was her life now. These four walls and these strangers and this cold, dark room that had belonged to someone else. "Be brave, little bird." Her mother's voice, clear as if she were standing in the room. "Be braver than I was." Hannah closed her eyes and took a long, shaking breath. Then another. Then another. She wasn't brave. She'd never been brave. But she was still here, still breathing, still upright. Maybe that was brave enough. Outside, the storm continued to scream. Inside, the house settled around her with creaks and sighs, and the sound of people sleeping in separate rooms, separate beds, separate lives that had suddenly, irrevocably collided. Hannah lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling she couldn't see in the darkness. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would figure out how to exist in this place. Tomorrow she would learn the rhythms of this house and these people. Tomorrow she would begin the impossible task of making herself useful enough to keep, invisible enough to not cause problems. Tomorrow. But tonight she was just a girl who had been sold for $47 and a horse, lying alone in a stranger's house, trying not to think about how thoroughly she had disappeared from the world she used to know. The darkness pressed down on her like a weight, and somewhere in another room, a little girl named Jonah pressed her ear to the wall and listened to the new woman breathe, wondering if this one would stay or leave like everyone else always did. The storm howled. The house held its breath, and Hannah Lee closed her eyes against tears she refused to shed and waited for morning to come. Dawn came too early and too cold. Hannah woke to the sound of a door closing somewhere in the house, followed by heavy footsteps that she recognized as Grant's even before she was fully conscious. She opened her eyes to gray light filtering through the shutters, and for one disoriented moment had no idea where she was. Then memory crashed back. The storm, the transaction, the wagon ride through hell, and she understood that this was real. This was her life now. She sat up slowly, every muscle in her body protesting. The cold had worked itself so deep into her bones during the journey that even a night under blankets hadn't fully driven it out. Her dress was still damp in places, stiff and uncomfortable against her skin. She needed to change, to wash, to make herself presentable for whatever this day would demand of her. But first, she needed to understand the house. Hannah stood and moved to the window, opening the shutters as quietly as she could. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine across everything she could see, the yard, the barn, the distant fence lines. In the early morning light, it looked almost beautiful, like something from a fairy story her mother used to tell her. But Hannah knew better than to trust beauty. Under that white blanket was frozen ground and killing cold and 100 ways to die if you weren't careful. She turned from the window and assessed her room in daylight. It was exactly as sparse as it had seemed the night before. No, wait, there was something. On the small table beside the basin, someone had left a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Hannah picked it up carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting was feminine, looping, and careful. Keep the fire steady, not high. Bread burns at the edges first. Watch for it. Kitchen advice. Left by whom? Grant's late wife? Hannah folded the note again and set it back down, feeling like she'd stumbled onto something sacred and private that wasn't meant for her. Outside her door, she heard more sounds now, small feet on floorboards, the clatter of something being set down. A child's voice quickly shushed. The house was waking up, which meant she needed to be awake too, needed to be useful, needed to prove that $47 and a horse hadn't been wasted on her. Hannah poured water from the pitcher into the basin, ice cold, of course, and washed her face and hands with movements that were almost violent in their efficiency. She changed into her work dress, the one that was already stained and patched in a dozen places. She braided her hair with fingers that shook slightly and pinned it up in a way that her mother had taught her a lifetime ago. Then she opened her door and stepped out into the main room of the house, ready to meet whatever judgment waited for her there. Lucas was at the table, eating something from a bowl with mechanical precision. He looked up when Hannah entered, his dark eyes tracking her movement across the room, but he said nothing, just watched, always watching. Jonah was by the stove, standing on a stool that was clearly meant for this purpose, stirring something in a pot that sent steam rising toward the ceiling. She turned when Hannah approached, her small face smudged with ash, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," Hannah said, keeping her voice gentle. Jonah stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to the pot without responding. The rejection stung more than Hannah had expected, but she pushed the feeling down and moved closer, peering into the pot. Porridge, thick and bubbling, the smell of it bland but not unpleasant. "That looks good," Hannah offered. "Do you make breakfast every morning?" Jonah's stirring faltered for just a second. Then she nodded, still not looking at Hannah directly. "She does," Lucas said from the table, his voice flat. "Someone has to." The implication was clear. You weren't here, so we learned to manage without anyone. Hannah absorbed the hit and kept her expression neutral. "Well, I'm here now. Maybe I can help." "We don't need help," Lucas said. "Lucas." Grant's voice came from the doorway, sharp enough to cut. He stood there still wearing his heavy coat, snow dusting his shoulders, a bucket in one hand. "Mind your manners." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he dropped his gaze to his bowl. "Yes, sir." Grant set the bucket down by the door. Milk, Hannah realized, fresh from the morning milking, and looked at her with that same assessing expression he'd worn the night before. "You're up." "Yes, sir." The words came automatically, years of living with Uncle Silas teaching her to be deferential to men who held power over her. Something flickered in Grant's eyes, discomfort maybe, or disapproval, but all he said was, "Jonah will show you where things are kept. Breakfast is almost ready. After we eat, I'll need you to look after Becky while I work in the barn. Lucas will be with me. Jonah has lessons." "Lessons?" Hannah asked before she could stop herself. "Reading and numbers," Grant said. 2 hours every morning. Their mother started it. I keep it going." He paused, then added almost defensively, Education matters. Hannah nodded, unexpectedly moved by this. A widowed rancher in the middle of nowhere making sure his children could read. Of course it does. Grant studied her for a moment longer, as if trying to determine whether she was mocking him, then turned toward one of the back rooms. I'll get Becky up. She's slow in the mornings. He disappeared through the doorway, and Hannah was left alone with the two older children, and a silence that felt heavy with things unsaid. She moved to the bucket of milk and picked it up, looking around for where it should go. Jonah pointed wordlessly to a shelf near the window where other provisions were kept: flour, salt, a few preserved vegetables in jars. Hannah carried the bucket over and set it down, then turned back to find both children still watching her. "How long have you been doing this?" Hannah asked quietly. "Taking care of the house?" "Since Mama died," Jonah said, so softly Hannah almost missed it. 11 months and 13 days. The precision of it broke something in Hannah's chest. 11 months and 13 days. This child had been counting every single one. "That's a long time to carry so much responsibility," Hannah said. Jonah's eyes suddenly shone with tears that she blinked away furiously. "We manage fine." "I'm sure you do." Hannah took a step closer, then stopped when Jonah tensed. "But maybe now you don't have to manage alone." "We don't know you," Lucas said from the table, his voice hard despite his youth. "Papa bought you same as he'd buy a plow horse. That doesn't make you family." The words landed like stones, each one precise and meant to hurt. Hannah felt her face heat, but she forced herself to meet the boy's eyes steadily. "You're right," she said. "It doesn't. And I'm not here to replace anyone or pretend to be something I'm not. But I am here, and I can cook and clean and help carry some of what you've been carrying, if you'll let me." Lucas stared at her, clearly not expecting that response. Before he could say anything else, Grant returned carrying a small figure bundled in a blanket. Becky, still half asleep, her blonde curls wild around her face. She lifted her head from her father's shoulder and looked at Hannah with sleepy blue eyes. "Who dat?" "This is Hannah," Grant said, his voice gentling again in that way it only did for the youngest child. "She's going to be staying with us. Remember I told you someone new was coming?" Becky studied Hannah with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only small children can manage. Then she yawned, showing tiny white teeth, and tucked her head back against Grant's shoulder. "Okay." Just like that. "Okay." As if the presence of a stranger in their house was no more remarkable than the weather changing. Grant carried her to the table and settled her in a chair, wrapping the blanket more securely around her small body. "Eat your breakfast, little bird. Then Hannah will watch you while I work." Little bird, the same endearment Hannah's mother had used for her. She felt something twist in her chest, sharp and unexpected. Breakfast was porridge served in mismatched bowls, with a small amount of honey drizzled on top for the children. Hannah waited until everyone else had been served before taking her own portion, years of being last in line under Uncle Silas's roof making it automatic. She sat at the far end of the table and ate in silence, listening to the small sounds of the family around her. Spoons scraping bowls, Becky humming tunelessly to herself, Grant giving quiet instructions to Lucas about the day's work. It was strange, intimate, like being allowed to observe something private that didn't belong to her. When the meal was finished, Grant stood and reached for his coat. Lucas immediately jumped up to follow, clearly eager to escape to the barn and away from Hannah's presence. "Jonah, get your slate," Grant said. "You know what sections to work on." Jonah nodded and disappeared into one of the back rooms, returning with a small chalkboard and a piece of chalk worn down to a nub. She settled at the table with the kind of focus that spoke of routine, of something she'd done 100 times before. Grant turned to Hannah. "Becky needs to be dressed and her hair combed. She'll want to play, but don't let her go outside. It's too cold yet. Keep the stove fed, but not too high. There's mending in the basket by the window if you need something to do with your hands." Instructions, tasks, ways to be useful. "I understand," Hannah said. Grant nodded once, then headed for the door with Lucas trailing behind him. Just before he stepped outside, he paused and looked back at her. "The note by your basin. My wife left dozens of them all over the house. I've been finding them for months. You can throw it away if you want." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a solid thud that seemed to seal Hannah inside with three small strangers and a dead woman's advice. Becky was watching her now with more alertness, the food and warmth having fully woken her. "You gonna stay?" she asked, her voice high and sweet. "I think so," Hannah said carefully. "The last lady didn't stay." Hannah's heart stuttered. "There was someone else?" "Mrs. Brennan from town," Jonah said without looking up from her slate. "She came for 2 weeks after Mama died. Said we were too wild and left in the middle of the night." Too wild. These quiet, wounded children who seemed afraid to make noise or take up space. Hannah couldn't imagine it. "Well," Hannah said, moving closer to Becky, "I'm not Mrs. Brennan. Now, shall we get you dressed for the day?" What followed was her first real test. Becky was cooperative in the way small children are when they're used to having to do things for themselves. Patient with the awkward way Hannah buttoned her dress, quiet while Hannah worked a comb through the tangles in her hair. But there was a distance there too, a watchfulness. This child had learned not to attach, not to hope, not to expect anyone to stay. Hannah understood that. She'd learned the same lessons herself. By mid-morning, Hannah had dressed Becky, tidied the breakfast dishes, fed the stove with wood from the box beside it, and started investigating the house more thoroughly. The mending basket Grant had mentioned was overflowing, shirts with torn seams, socks with holes, a small dress that had lost most of its buttons. All of it clean but neglected, the kind of repairs that got pushed aside when you were just trying to survive each day. Hannah settled by the window with the basket in her lap and began to work. The movements were familiar, comforting even. Her mother had taught her to sew before she could write, and the needle moving through fabric required no thought, leaving her mind free to wander and observe. Becky played on the floor nearby with a set of carved wooden animals, creating elaborate stories in whispered tones. At the table, Jonah scratched careful numbers onto her slate, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. Outside, Hannah could occasionally hear Grant's voice calling instructions to Lucas, the sounds muffled by distance and walls. It was domestic, peaceful, and utterly foreign to someone who'd spent 7 years being tolerated rather than included. "What you making?" Becky asked, abandoning her animals to come peer at Hannah's hands. "I'm fixing your brother's shirt," Hannah said, holding it up to show the seam she was repairing. "See? It was torn here, but now it'll hold together again." Becky reached out with one small finger to touch the neat line of stitches. "Mama used to fix things." "Did she?" "She was real good at it," Becky said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way children spoke of lost parents, sad but not devastated, the grief too big to hold in one piece so it came out in small, manageable observations. "Better than Papa. He tries, but his fingers are too big for the little stitches." Hannah felt her throat tighten. She could picture it too easily. Grant hunched over these same garments with those calloused, work-roughened hands, trying to thread a needle and repair his children's clothes because there was no one else to do it. "Well," Hannah said carefully, "maybe I can help with that now." Becky considered this, her small face serious. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her animals. The hours passed in a rhythm that Hannah gradually learned to read. When the sun reached a certain point in the sky, Jonah closed her slate and started preparing lunch. Cold biscuits left from yesterday, some preserved meat, apples from the cellar. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone twice her age, and when Hannah tried to help, Jonah politely but firmly redirected her. "Papa likes things a certain way," she explained. Translation: "Don't disrupt what we've learned to do without you." Hannah stepped back and let the child work, though it cost her something to watch a 6-year-old perform tasks that should have fallen to an adult. When Grant and Lucas returned for the midday meal, there was a tension in the air that Hannah couldn't quite identify. Grant's jaw was tight, and Lucas looked like he'd been crying, though he ducked his head to hide it. They ate in silence, and Hannah didn't dare ask what had happened. After lunch, Grant pulled on his coat again. "I'll be checking the fence line in the north pasture. Lucas, you're with me. We'll be back before dark." "Can I come?" Jonah asked, her voice small and hopeful. "Not today, little one. Too cold. You stay inside with Hannah and Becky." Jonah's face fell, but she nodded obediently. Hannah watched this small disappointment play out and made a mental note. The children want to be with their father, want his attention, his time, his approval. After Grant and Lucas left, Hannah turned to Jonah. Your lessons are finished for the day? Jonah nodded. Then would you teach me where everything is kept? I'd like to start dinner, but I don't want to disturb your father's arrangements. For the first time, Jonah looked at her with something other than suspicion. You want me to show you? I do. You know this house better than I ever will. I'd be grateful for your help. Something softened in Jonah's face. She stood up straighter, pride mixing with surprise. Okay, I can do that. What followed was a tour of the kitchen from a 6-year-old's perspective. Jonah showed Hannah where the flour and cornmeal were kept, how much wood the stove needed, which pots were for what purposes. She explained in careful, serious tones that Papa didn't like onions in his stew, that Lucas would only eat carrots if they were cut small, that Becky had to have her milk warmed or she'd get a stomachache. Hannah listened and made mental notes of all of it, seeing with new clarity how much these children had taken on. They hadn't just survived their mother's death. They'd become the architects of their own survival, learning through trial and error what worked and what didn't, what kept their father from completely collapsing under the weight of his grief. You've done an amazing job, Hannah said when the tour was complete. Your mama would be proud of how well you've kept everything going. Jonah's eyes filled with tears so suddenly that Hannah was startled. The little girl turned away quickly, her shoulders hunching. Don't talk about Mama, she said, her voice thick. It makes it hurt again. Hannah's heart cracked. She wanted to reach out, to comfort, but she held herself back, sensing that touch would be unwelcome. I'm sorry. I won't mention her again unless you want me to. Jonah nodded without turning around, then fled to the back room where she slept, leaving Hannah standing alone in the kitchen with Becky, who had witnessed the entire exchange with wide, solemn eyes. Jonah cries sometimes, Becky said conversationally, but only when Papa can't see. Does she? Uh-huh. At night, I hear her. Hannah knelt down so she was at eye level with the little girl. Do you cry too? Becky thought about this for a moment, her face scrunched in concentration. Sometimes, but I don't remember Mama as good as they do. Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like. The casual devastation of it nearly undid Hannah. This child, barely more than a baby, already forgetting the woman who had given her life. That's all right, Hannah said gently. It doesn't mean you loved her any less. That's what Papa says too. Becky tilted her head, studying Hannah with those clear blue eyes. Are you going to be our new mama? Hannah stopped, the question catching her completely off guard. I don't know, sweetheart. I don't think so. Okay, Becky said, accepting this with the same easy acceptance she'd shown that morning. Then she went back to her animals, and Hannah was left kneeling on the floor, trying to understand what she'd just agreed to and what she hadn't. The afternoon stretched long and strange. Hannah made bread, following the instructions from the note she'd found. Keep the fire steady, not high. And to her surprise, it turned out well. Not perfect, but edible, and better than the hard burned loaves she'd produced for Uncle Silas. She started a stew with preserved vegetables and some of the meat from the cold cellar, adding the spices carefully, trying to balance what she knew with what Jonah had told her about the family's preferences. While the food cooked, she worked on the mending, finding a strange peace in the repetitive motion of the needle. Becky eventually climbed into her lap, and Hannah led her, adjusting her position so the child could see the stitches form. Will you teach me? Becky asked. To sew? Uh-huh. Mama was teaching me, but then... She trailed off, the sentence needing no completion. I'd be happy to teach you, Hannah said. But maybe we start with something simple. How about I show you how to thread a needle? They spent the next hour like that, Hannah guiding Becky's small fingers, praising her efforts even when the thread went everywhere except through the eye of the needle. It was sweet, tender. The kind of moment Hannah had thought she'd never have, a child trusting her, wanting to learn from her, choosing to be close to her. When Jonah emerged from the back room, her eyes were red but dry. She stood in the doorway watching them for a long moment before speaking. The bread smells good, she said quietly. Thank you, Hannah replied. Would you like to help me finish the stew? Jonah hesitated, clearly torn between her earlier retreat and the olive branch being offered. Finally, she nodded and moved to the stove, and together they worked on the evening meal in a silence that was less hostile than it had been that morning. Grant and Lucas returned just as the sun was starting to set, both of them red-faced from cold and exhaustion. Grant stopped in the doorway, and Hannah saw his nose lift slightly, catching the smell of bread and stew. Something crossed his face, surprise maybe, or relief, before his expression closed down again. "Smells good," he said, echoing his daughter's earlier words. "It's almost ready," Hannah told him. "If you'd like to wash up, we can eat soon." He nodded and moved toward the basin, Lucas trailing behind him with his head still down. Hannah noticed the boy had been crying again. His eyes were swollen and his breathing had that hitched quality that came after hard tears, but Grant seemed determined to ignore it. Dinner was the real test. Hannah served the food with hands that trembled slightly, hyper-aware of 4 pairs of eyes watching every move she made. The bread was sliced and placed on the table. The stew was ladled into bowls. Everyone sat in what were clearly their assigned places, with Hannah taking the seat that had been left empty. The wife's seat, she realized. The mother's seat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Grant picked up his spoon and tasted the stew. Hannah watched his face, trying to read his reaction, but he was as unreadable as stone. "It's good," he said finally. "Different from how—" He stopped. "It's good." High praise, apparently, because Jonah and Lucas immediately started eating, as if their father's approval had granted them permission. Becky, already eating with the enthusiasm of a child who didn't understand tension, hummed happily to herself. Hannah picked up her own spoon but found she couldn't eat. Her stomach was twisted too tight, her nerves too raw. She'd passed some kind of test, but she wasn't sure what it meant or what came next. "You used time," Grant said suddenly. Hannah looked up, startled. "Yes. Is that— should I not have?" "No, it's—" He paused, his jaw working. "My wife used time. I'd forgotten what it tasted like." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and aching. Hannah didn't know what to say to it, how to respond to grief she could sense but not fully understand. "I can use different spices," she offered quietly. "If it's too difficult." Grant met her eyes across the table, and for the first time since she'd met him, Hannah saw past the stone exterior to the man beneath, exhausted, grieving, trying so hard to hold himself and his children together that he'd forgotten how to bend. "No," he said. "Don't change it. It's good to remember some things." They finished the meal in silence after that. But it was a different quality of silence than before. Less hostile, more thoughtful. As if everyone at the table was recalibrating, trying to figure out where this stranger fit into the patterns of their lives. After dinner, Hannah cleaned while Grant got Becky ready for bed. She could hear him in the back room, his deep voice soft as he told his youngest daughter some kind of story. Jonah and Lucas had disappeared to their own rooms, leaving Hannah alone with the dishes and the dying fire and her thoughts. She was scrubbing the last pot when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Grant standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression uncertain. "You did well today," he said. Hannah blinked, surprised. "Thank you. The children, they're not easy. They've been hurt. They don't trust quickly." "I understand that." Grant studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of yellowed paper. "I found this one in the barn. My wife left them everywhere. Advice, reminders, little notes about the children or the house." He held it out to Hannah. "Thought you might want it." Hannah took the paper carefully and unfolded it. The same feminine handwriting. Jonah loves stories before bed. Lucas pretends he doesn't, but he listens from his room. Make them long. Make them full of brave people who survive hard things. Hannah read it twice, feeling the ache of it, the ghost of a woman who had known her children so well and had tried to leave pieces of that knowledge behind. "Why are you giving these to me?" she asked quietly. Grant was silent for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Then, "Because someone should have them. Someone should know what she knew. And you're here. You're trying. That's more than I had any right to expect for $47 and a horse." The amount, the price of her, hung between them, neither comfortable nor cruel, just a fact they both had to live with. I'll do my best, Hannah said, because what else could she say? Grant nodded slowly. That's all any of us can do. He turned to leave, then paused. The note. From this morning. About the bread. You followed it. I did. It showed. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with whatever he was trying to say. Sleep well, Hannah. Then he was gone, retreating to his own room, and Hannah was alone again with a dead woman's note and the slowly growing understanding that this house wasn't just grieving a wife and mother, it was starving for any small gesture of care, any tiny seed of warmth that might take root in frozen ground. She finished cleaning and banked the fire for the night, then retreated to her own small room. But before she lay down, she carefully placed both notes, the one about bread, the one about stories, on the small table by her bed where she could see them. Someone should know what she knew. Hannah didn't know if she could fill the space left by the woman who had written these notes. Didn't know if she was meant to or even if she wanted to. But she could try, she could learn, she could pay attention to these wounded people, and maybe, if she was careful enough, gentle enough, patient enough, she could help them remember how to breathe. Outside her window, the night was clear and cold, stars hard and bright against the darkness. Somewhere in the house, a child coughed. A door creaked. The ordinary sounds of a household settling into sleep. Hannah closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring, what small tests and tiny victories might be waiting in the hours ahead. But sleep wouldn't come easily, and she lay there for a long time, listening to the house breathe around her and wondering if a person could learn to become necessary, to become chosen, or if she would always be exactly what she'd been bought to be. Temporary help until something better came along. In the morning, she would wake to find a small note pinned near the stove, written in Grant's rough hand, "Use maple for steady heat." And Hannah would understand that this was his way of teaching her, of including her, of slowly, carefully letting her into the patterns of survival they had built. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was something. And in a house that had learned to survive on nothing, something felt like hope. The notes continued. Over the following weeks, Hannah found them tucked in strange places, folded inside the flour tin, pinned to the inside of the cupboard door, wedged between jars of preserves in the cellar. Each one was written in that same careful feminine hand. Each one contained some small piece of wisdom about the house, or the children, or the land itself. Lucas is left-handed. Don't try to change it. The pump freezes in February. Keep a bucket of water by the stove. Becky's nightmares are worse during new moons. She won't say why. Hannah collected them all, creating a small stack on her bedside table that grew thicker with each passing day. She read them at night before sleeping, studying them like a student preparing for an examination she couldn't afford to fail. And slowly, carefully, she began to apply what she learned. She made sure Lucas's place at the table was set with the spoon on the left side. She filled buckets with water even though February was still weeks away. She paid closer attention to Becky on dark nights, ready to comfort when the little girl woke crying from dreams she wouldn't describe. The children noticed. Of course they noticed. Children always did. "How did you know I like my eggs cooked all the way through?" Lucas asked one morning, suspicion sharp in his voice. Hannah could have told him about the note she'd found. Lucas won't eat runny yolks. He says they look like eyes watching him. But something stopped her. These messages felt sacred somehow, like letters from a ghost who was trying to help her daughter's replacement succeed. Sharing them felt like a betrayal. "I guessed," Hannah said simply. "Was I right?" Lucas stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly and went back to eating. But Grant had been standing in the doorway, and Hannah saw the way his expression shifted, surprise, recognition, something that looked almost like relief. He knew she'd found another note, and he was grateful she hadn't told the children, hadn't disturbed whatever fragile piece they'd built around their mother's memory. That night, Hannah found a new note near her basin, but this one was written in Grant's rough hand. "Thank you." 2 words, but they carried the weight of a man who'd been drowning and had just been thrown a rope. Hannah folded the note carefully and added it to her collection, this one somehow more precious than all the others combined. The days developed a rhythm. Hannah woke before dawn to start the fire and begin breakfast. Grant and Lucas headed to the barn while Jonah did her lessons and Becky played nearby. Midday meals were simple, eaten quickly so Grant could return to work. Afternoons were for mending, cooking, the endless small tasks that kept a household running. Evenings were for stories. Hannah had taken the dead woman's advice to heart and told long tales of brave people surviving impossible things, making them up as she went while Jonah and Becky listened with rapt attention and Lucas pretended not to hear from his room. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was something warmer than what had been before. And then came the morning that changed everything. Hannah woke to the sound of crying, not the usual nighttime whimpers of a child caught in bad dreams, but deep, racking sobs that spoke of real pain. She was out of bed and moving before her mind fully caught up, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor as she rushed toward the sound. It was coming from the children's room. Hannah pushed the door open to find Jonah kneeling beside Becky's small bed, her face streaked with tears, while Becky lay very still, her skin flushed and hot even from across the room. "She's burning up," Jonah gasped when she saw Hannah. "I tried to wake her, but she won't open her eyes and she's so hot. She's so hot." Hannah was at the bedside in 3 steps, her hand going to Becky's forehead. The child was radiating heat like a stove, her small body trembling with fever, her breathing fast and shallow. Terror shot through Hannah's chest, sharp and immediate. "Get your father," she said, her voice steady despite the fear. "Now, Jonah, run!" Jonah fled, and Hannah heard her small feet pounding through the house, heard the crash of Grant's door being thrown open, heard the confusion in Grant's voice as he was torn from sleep. But Hannah's focus was entirely on the little girl in front of her, this tiny person who had just started to trust her, who had climbed into her lap and asked to learn to sew, who hummed while she ate and believed in the goodness of strangers. Grant appeared in the doorway, half-dressed, his hair wild. One look at his daughter, and all the color drained from his face. "No," he said, the word barely a whisper. "No, not again. Not again." His wife had died of fever. Hannah understood in that instant. This wasn't just a sick child. This was history repeating itself. This was the nightmare that had been stalking this family since the moment they buried their mother and wife. "How long has she been like this?" Grant demanded, moving to the bedside. "I don't know," Jonah sobbed. "She was fine at bedtime. I swear, Papa, she was fine." "It's not your fault," Hannah said quickly, firmly. "Fever can come on fast, especially in children. We need to bring her temperature down. Grant, I need cold water, clean cloths, and whiskey if you have it." He stared at her for a moment, and Hannah saw the edge of panic in his eyes, a man reliving his worst moment, paralyzed by the fear of losing another person he loved. "Grant," Hannah said, sharper now, "I need those things, now." The command seemed to break through his paralysis. He nodded once and disappeared, and Hannah could hear him moving through the house with purpose. She turned her attention back to Becky, carefully stripping away the blankets that were trapping heat against the child's small body. "What are you doing?" Lucas had appeared in the doorway, his face pale with fear. "Helping her," Hannah said. "Lucas, I need you to be brave right now. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his throat working. "Good. Go stoke the fire in the main room and put on water to boil. We're going to need it warm, not hot. Warm like bath water. Can you do that for me?" Lucas ran, grateful for a task, for something to do besides watch his little sister burn. Grant returned with a bucket of cold water drawn from the well, several clean cloths, and a bottle of amber liquid. Hannah soaked one of the cloths and began running it over Becky's forehead, her neck, her small wrists where the pulse fluttered too fast. "The whiskey is for sterilizing," Grant said, his voice hollow. "And for medicinal purposes if we need it," Hannah replied. "But let's focus on bringing down the fever first." For the next hour they worked in tandem, Hannah cooling Becky's burning skin with damp cloths while Grant held his daughter's hand and whispered things Hannah couldn't quite hear. Prayers, maybe. Please. The desperate bargaining of a man who'd already lost too much. Jonah and Lucas huddled in the doorway, neither willing to leave but neither able to help, their faces reflecting the same terror Hannah saw in Grant's eyes. When Becky's breathing grew more labored, Hannah made a decision. "We need to move her to the main room where it's warmer and I can watch her constantly. Grant, can you carry her?" He gathered his daughter up as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest with a tenderness that made Hannah's throat tight. They processed through the house like a funeral march, Grant with Becky, Hannah following with the water and cloths, Jonah and Lucas trailing behind, all of them silent except for the sound of Becky's ragged breathing. Grant settled into the chair nearest the stove with Becky in his lap, unwilling to put her down, unwilling to let her go even for a moment. Hannah understood. If he put her down, if he released her, it would feel too much like the last time, too much like giving up. "I'm going to make a tea," Hannah said. "Willow bark if you have it. It'll help with the fever." "Cellar," Grant said without looking up. "Third shelf, brown jar." Hannah found it exactly where he'd said, along with several other medicinal herbs that spoke to a household used to managing their own illnesses. She brewed the tea strong and brought it back to the main room, but Becky was still unconscious, unable to drink. "We'll have to get it into her drop by drop," Hannah said. "It'll take time, but we can do it." What followed were the longest hours of Hannah's life. She sat beside Grant, carefully parting Becky's lips and letting tiny amounts of the bitter tea slide into the child's mouth, waiting to make sure she swallowed before giving more. Grant held his daughter and rocked her slowly, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been the stories his wife used to tell. Jonah and Lucas eventually fell asleep on the floor nearby, their small bodies curled together for comfort, unable to stay awake but unwilling to leave. Dawn came with no improvement. The fever raged on, and Becky remained frighteningly still, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too fragile to sustain life. "I should ride for the doctor," Grant said suddenly, his voice hoarse from hours of not speaking. "In town. It's a half-day's ride, but—" "You can't leave her," Hannah said gently. "And we both know the doctor couldn't get here any faster than you could get there. We're her best chance right now. We just need to keep fighting." "Like you fought for your mother?" The words came out harsh, accusatory, and Hannah saw the moment Grant realized what he'd said. His face crumpled. "Christ, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's all right," Hannah said, "though it wasn't. Not really." "You're scared. I understand." "My wife died in my arms," Grant said, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. "I held her just like this for 3 days while the fever ate her alive, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't save her. I couldn't even make it easier. She just burned and burned until there was nothing left, and I held her the whole time like a fool who thought love could be enough." His voice broke on the last word, and Hannah saw tears sliding down his weathered face, cutting tracks through dirt and exhaustion. "Love is enough," Hannah said quietly. "It doesn't always save them, but it matters. She knew you were there. She didn't die alone. That counts for something." "Does it?" Grant looked at her with eyes that were drowning. "Because right now it feels like the only thing I'm good at is watching the people I love disappear." Hannah wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but she had no words that could make this better. So instead she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on Becky's back, the first time she'd deliberately touched him since that night in the wagon. "You're not alone this time," she said. "We're going to fight for her together." Grant's eyes met hers, and something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, maybe, or understanding, or just the desperate solidarity of two people standing against the dark. "Together," he repeated, and his hand turned under hers, his fingers curling around her palm like a lifeline. They stayed like that as the sun climbed higher, as the house warmed, as Jonah and Lucas woke and crept close to watch their sister breathe. Hannah continued the slow, patient work of getting medicine into Becky drop by drop. Grant held his daughter and rocked her. And between them, their hands stayed clasped, neither willing to let go. It was late afternoon when Becky stirred. The movement was small, just a flutter of her eyelids, a tiny shift in her breathing, but they all saw it. Grant's whole body went rigid with hope and fear. "Becky?" he whispered. "Baby girl, can you hear Papa?" Another flutter, then her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with fever, but open. Alive. "Papa?" Her voice was barely audible, cracked and dry. "I'm here, little bird. Papa's right here." Becky's gaze drifted, found Hannah. "Mama Hannah?" The name, that name, hit Hannah like a physical blow. She felt Grant's hand tighten around hers, felt the weight of what this child had just said, what it meant, what it changed. "I'm here too, sweetheart," Hannah managed, her voice thick. "Thirsty," Becky whispered. They gave her water, small sips that she took eagerly. Her fever was still high, but no longer the terrifying inferno it had been. She was present, aware, fighting. "You're doing so good, baby," Grant said, his voice breaking. So good." Becky's eyes drifted closed again, but this time it was sleep, not unconsciousness. Real sleep, healing sleep, the kind that meant the body was winning its battle. Grant lowered his head, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Hannah felt her own tears spilling over, relief mixing with exhaustion until she couldn't tell them apart. Jonah and Lucas were crying too, wrapped around each other, the tension that had held them all captive for hours finally releasing. "Thank you," Grant said when he could speak again. "Thank you, Hannah. I couldn't have if you hadn't been here." "But I was here," Hannah said firmly, "and she's going to be all right. We caught it in time." The words hung in the air, and Hannah realized she'd said "we" without thinking. Not you or I, but we. As if somewhere in the long night and longer day, they'd become a unit, a team. Something more than employer and employee, more than stranger and stranger. Grant seemed to realize it too. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Stay with us," he said suddenly. "Not just, I don't mean the arrangement we made. I mean really stay, be part of this family. These children need you. I need—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Please, don't leave." Hannah opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Jonah spoke up from the floor. "You called her Mama Hannah," she said to Becky, who was still sleeping. Then she looked at Hannah with eyes that were assessing, cautious, but no longer quite so guarded. "Is that what you are now? Our mama?" Hannah faltered, not sure how to answer, not sure what answer was true. "You stayed up all night to save her," Lucas said, his voice rough but no longer hostile. "Mama would have done that." "Your mama would have done it better," Hannah said quietly. "I'm not trying to replace her. I could never—" "We know," Jonah interrupted. "But maybe you could be something else, something new, not Mama, but not just the lady Papa bought either." Hannah felt something crack open inside her chest. "What would I be then?" Jonah considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "Ours," she said finally. "You'd be ours. If you want to be. If you want to be." As if Hannah had a choice. As if she hadn't already been choosing them with every note she'd read, every meal she'd cooked, every small kindness she'd offered. As if her heart hadn't already been caught by these wounded, brave children and their father who was trying so hard not to drown. "I want to be," Hannah whispered. "I want to be yours." Grant's hand was still in hers. He squeezed it once, firm and deliberate, and when Hannah looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not love. Not yet. Maybe never. But something like recognition. Like seeing another person clearly for the first time and understanding that they were real, they mattered, they had become necessary. For 3 more days, Hannah didn't leave Becky's side. She slept in the chair by the stove when exhaustion forced her to close her eyes, woke at the slightest sound from the child, administered medicine and water, and soft foods as Becky slowly regained her strength. Grant brought her meals and tried to convince her to rest properly, but Hannah refused. She'd made a promise. "I want to be yours." And she intended to keep it. On the 4th morning, Becky woke clear-eyed and asking for pancakes, and Hannah knew the crisis had truly passed. She made the pancakes while tears of relief streamed down her face, and when she served them, Becky ate with the enthusiasm of someone who'd forgotten what food tasted like. "You cried for me," Becky said suddenly, looking at Hannah with those bright blue eyes. "Jonah says you cried." "I did," Hannah admitted. "How come?" "Because I love you." The realization hit Hannah like a lightning strike. Somewhere in the past weeks, these children had stopped being strangers, had stopped being responsibilities, had become something infinitely more dangerous and precious. She loved them, loved their bravery and their wounds and their careful, tentative trust, loved them in a way that was fierce and protective and terrifying. "Because you matter to me," Hannah said instead. Because I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Becky nodded as if this made perfect sense, then went back to her pancakes. That evening, after the children were in bed, Grant found Hannah in the kitchen finishing the dishes. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching her work, and when she turned to ask if he needed something, the words died in her throat at the expression on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. Hannah set down the dish she'd been drying. "All right. When I went to town to find a housekeeper, I wasn't looking for a wife. I wasn't looking for someone to love or someone to love me. I just needed—" He stopped, searching for words. "I just needed the bleeding to stop. The house was falling apart. The children were falling apart. I was falling apart. And I thought if I could just get someone to keep things running, maybe we'd survive long enough to figure out how to live again." Hannah waited, sensing there was more. "But then Silas offered you, and I saw this girl who looked like she'd already survived things I couldn't imagine, and I thought you'd understand. What it feels like to just be trying to make it through each day, what it costs to keep going when everything in you wants to stop." "I did understand," Hannah said softly. "I do understand." Grant nodded. "I know, that's why I—" He stopped again, his jaw working. "Yesterday, a friend of mine came by the barn, asked about you, said things about why a man my age would buy a young girl, what I must be getting out of the arrangement besides housework." Hannah felt her stomach drop. She'd known people would talk, had braced herself for it, but hearing it spoken aloud still hurt. "I told him you were just here for convenience," Grant continued, and now his voice was rough with something that might have been shame. "Said I chose you because you were young enough to work hard and not make demands. Said it meant nothing, you meant nothing. You were just another set of hands to keep the house together." The words landed like blows. Hannah tried to keep her face neutral, tried not to show how deeply they cut, but she must have failed because Grant flinched. "I lied," he said quickly. "I lied to protect your reputation, to keep him from saying worse things, from making worse assumptions. But Hannah—" He took a step closer. "I lied because I didn't know how to tell the truth. Didn't know how to admit that that these past weeks you've—" He was struggling, and Hannah wanted to help him, wanted to offer him the words he couldn't find, but her own throat was too tight to speak. "You matter," Grant said finally, simply. "You're not convenient. You're not just hands to do work. You stayed up for 3 days to save my daughter. You've been reading my wife's notes and learning everything about my children because you care, not because I'm paying you. You've given us something I thought we'd lost forever, and I don't even know what to call it, but it's not nothing. It's everything." Hannah felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Grant, I don't know if I can love again," he said, and the honesty of it was brutal and beautiful at once. "I don't know if I remember how. My wife, she was my whole world, and when she died, something in me died too. But I know that I can't breathe when I think about you leaving. I know that when I see you with my children, something that's been frozen inside me starts to thaw. I know that you're not just the woman I bought to keep my house. You're—" He stopped, and Hannah waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're becoming part of us," he finished quietly. "And I need you to know that. Need you to know that you're not nothing. You've never been nothing." Hannah couldn't speak, couldn't find words big enough to hold what she was feeling. So she just nodded, and Grant nodded back, and they stood there in the kitchen with 3 sleeping children nearby and something fragile and new forming in the space between them. "Thank you for telling me," Hannah managed finally. Grant nodded again, then turned to leave, but he paused in the doorway and looked back at her. "The note I left you, the one that just said thank you. Yes? I meant it. For everything. For staying. For caring. For being here when we needed you most." Then he was gone, and Hannah was alone with her thoughts, and her wildly beating heart, and the understanding that something had shifted, something had changed, something had been said that couldn't be unsaid. She finished the dishes in a daze and went to bed, but couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying Grant's words. "You matter. You're becoming part of us. I can't breathe when I think about you leaving. Not love." He'd been clear about that. But something something that felt like it could grow into love if they were careful with it, if they nurtured it, if they gave it time and space and patience. Hannah lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine a future where she wasn't just borrowed time, wasn't just $47 and a horse, wasn't just convenient. Tried to imagine being chosen, being wanted, being loved. It felt dangerous to hope for it, but she hoped anyway. Outside her window, the night was cold and clear. Inside the house, everyone slept, even Becky, healthy now, her fever broken, her nightmares held at bay. And in the kitchen, pinned near the stove where Hannah would find it in the morning, was a new note in Grant's rough hand. "You saved her. You saved all of us. Don't leave." 3 sentences. But they held a world of meaning, a universe of possibility. Hannah would find it at dawn, would read it with shaking hands and burning eyes, would fold it carefully and add it to her collection of notes from the dead and the living, from the woman who'd loved this family first, and the man who was learning to love again. And she would stay. Because somewhere between being bought and being needed, between surviving and living, between convenience and care, Hannah Lee had found something she'd been missing her whole life. She'd found home. Even if it was fragile, even if it was new, even if it could still break, it was hers. And she was theirs. And for now, that was enough. The morning Hannah found that note, "You saved her. You saved all of us. Don't leave," was the morning everything felt different. The air itself seemed lighter somehow, as if the house had been holding its breath for months and had finally remembered how to exhale. She stood by the stove with the paper trembling in her hands and felt something inside her chest unfold like a flower that had been waiting for spring. She was still standing there, still staring at Grant's rough handwriting, when she heard his footsteps on the porch. The door opened and he came in carrying an armful of wood, snow dusting his shoulders, his breath making clouds in the cold air. He stopped when he saw her, saw the note in her hands, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You found it," he said unnecessarily. "I found it," Hannah confirmed, her voice steady despite the chaos of feeling inside her. "And?" Grant set the wood down by the stove, his movements careful, controlled. "What's your answer?" Hannah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the hard exterior to the man beneath. Saw someone who'd been broken and was trying to learn how to be whole again. Saw someone who was offering her something precious and fragile and real. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The relief that crossed Grant's face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched, and for just a moment he looked younger, softer, like the man he might have been before grief had carved him into stone. "Good," he said roughly. That's good." They stood there in the quiet kitchen as the sun climbed higher and the children still slept, and something passed between them that felt like a promise. Not spoken, not formalized, but real nonetheless. The weeks that followed were different, warmer. Hannah couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift happened. There was no single moment, no grand gesture, but gradually the house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. The children laughed more. Grant smiled occasionally, small expressions that transformed his whole face. And Hannah found herself singing while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her that she'd forgotten she knew. It was Jonah who brought up the wildflowers first. They were having dinner one evening in early March, the windows showing the first real signs that winter might actually end someday, when Jonah suddenly said, "Mama's flowers will be coming up soon." The table went quiet. Lucas's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Becky looked confused, too young to fully remember. And Grant's face did that thing where it closed down, shuttering all emotion behind a wall of careful blankness. "What flowers, sweetheart?" Hannah asked gently when no one else spoke. "In the field behind the north pasture," Jonah explained, her voice small. "Mama loved them. Every spring she'd take us out there and we'd pick them and make crowns, and she'd tell us about how wildflowers were the bravest plants because they grew where nothing else could." She paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Papa won't go there anymore." Hannah looked at Grant and saw the grief written plainly on his face, raw and aching and still so fresh despite the months that had passed. "That's where we scattered her ashes," Lucas said quietly, and suddenly Hannah understood. The field wasn't just a place his wife had loved, it was where she rested, where part of her would always be. "I'd like to see it," Hannah said, the word surprising even herself. "When the flowers come up, if that would be all right." Grant's eyes snapped to hers, searching for something. Mockery, maybe, or false sympathy, or any of the 100 wrong reasons someone might want to visit a dead woman's resting place. But Hannah met his gaze steadily, honestly, and whatever he saw there made something in his expression soften. "She'd have liked you," he said, so quietly Hannah almost missed it. "My wife. She'd have liked your kindness." The compliment settled around Hannah's shoulders like a blessing from a ghost, and she felt honored by it in a way she couldn't quite explain. That night, after the children were asleep, Grant appeared in the kitchen where Hannah was finishing the day's bread for tomorrow. He stood in the doorway with something in his hands, a small wooden box worn smooth from years of handling. "I want to show you something," he said. Hannah wiped the flour from her hands and followed him to the table. He set the box down and opened it carefully, reverently, and Hannah saw it was full of small treasures: a woman's pearl necklace, a few letters tied with ribbon, a pressed flower, a lock of blonde hair. "These were hers," Grant said, touching each item gently. "The things I kept, the things I couldn't let go." Hannah waited, sensing he needed to do this at his own pace. "The necklace was my mother's," he continued, lifting it from the box. The pearls gleamed softly in the lamplight, modest but beautiful. "She gave it to my wife the day we married, said it should go to the woman who'd raise the next generation of Mercers." He paused, his thumb rubbing over the smooth beads. "I've been carrying this box around for months, not knowing what to do with it. Can't bear to keep it locked away, but can't bear to look at it either." "It's beautiful," Hannah said softly. "My wife wore it every Sunday to church," Grant said, "even when we had nothing else. Even when we were scraping by on hope and stubbornness, she'd put on this necklace and hold her head high. She said it reminded her that she came from strong women and she'd be a strong woman too." His voice cracked slightly. "She was. God, she was so strong. Right up until the end." Hannah didn't know what to say to that kind of grief, so she just reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the table. Grant looked at their joined hands for a long moment, then carefully, deliberately, he turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. "I want you to have it," he said. Hannah's breath caught. "Grant, I can't." "Yes, you can." His grip tightened. "You're raising my children. You're keeping this house alive. You're doing everything she would have done if she could have stayed. And I think—" He swallowed hard. "I think she'd want you to have it. Want you to know that you're not just temporary. You're not just convenient. You're the woman who's raising the next generation of Mercers." The weight of what he was offering hit Hannah like a physical force. This wasn't just a necklace. This was acceptance, recognition, a place in the family that went deeper than any arrangement or transaction. "I don't want to take her place," Hannah whispered. "You're not," Grant said firmly. "You're making your own place. And it's time you had something that says you belong here." With shaking hands, Hannah took the necklace. The pearls were cool and smooth against her skin, and when she fastened them around her neck, they settled against her collarbone like they'd been waiting for her. Grant looked at her wearing his mother's necklace, and his expression was complicated, grief and gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like wonder. "It suits you," he said quietly. That night, Hannah lay in bed touching the pearls at her throat and trying to understand what was happening to her life, to her heart. She'd come here as property, as something bought and sold. But somehow she was becoming something else, something chosen. The next morning brought disaster. Hannah woke to shouting, Grant's voice raised in a way she'd never heard before, sharp with panic and command. She was out of bed and running before her eyes were fully open, her heart already hammering with fear. Outside, chaos. The morning was gray with pre-dawn light, and in that dimness Hannah could see horses everywhere, the Mustang herd that Grant kept in the north pasture, wild-eyed and panicking, running in all directions. And in the middle of it, two small figures that made Hannah's blood turn to ice. Lucas and Jonah, separated from each other, both trying to get to the house, but cut off by the stampeding animals. Stay where you are, Grant was yelling, already running toward them. Don't move! Don't! Lucas, no! But Lucas had seen his sister, had seen her surrounded by frightened horses, and the boy did what any brave, foolish child would do. He ran toward her. A Mustang, spooked by his movement, reared up, and its hooves came down hard. Lucas went down like a puppet with cut strings. The scream that tore from Hannah's throat was primal, animal. She was running before she knew she'd decided to move, running toward the fallen boy while Grant veered toward Jonah, both of them operating on pure instinct and terror. Hannah reached Lucas first. He was conscious but clearly hurt, his face white with pain and shock, his left arm bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch. But he was alive. He was breathing. "It's okay, I've got you, you're okay," she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out in a steady stream as she gathered him up as carefully as she could. His weight in her arms was precious and terrible. This child who'd been so suspicious of her, who'd watched her with guarded eyes for weeks, now clinging to her and crying against her shoulder while she carried him toward the house. Grant had Jonah, was bringing her in too, and together they got the children inside while the Mustangs continued their panicked flight outside. Hannah laid Lucas on the table, the same table where they ate meals, where she'd kneaded bread just last night, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. "His arm is broken," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm, even though everything inside her was screaming. "Maybe his ribs too. Grant, we need to splint the arm and bind his chest and—" "I know," Grant said, but his voice was hollow, distant. He stood frozen by the door, staring at his son with an expression that Hannah recognized from Becky's fever. Paralysis, terror, the look of a man watching his worst nightmare unfold again. "Grant," Hannah said sharply, "I need you present. I need you here with me. We can save him, but I need your help." It was the same tone she'd used during Becky's illness, the command that had broken through his panic then. It worked again now. Grant's eyes focused, cleared, and he nodded once before moving into action. What followed was the most harrowing hour of Hannah's life. Between them, they set Lucas's arm as best they could, while the boy screamed and thrashed and begged them to stop. They bound his ribs with strips of clean cloth. They checked him for other injuries, finding bruises blooming across his skin, but nothing else that seemed life-threatening. Through it all, Jonah stood in the corner clutching Becky, both girls crying silently, watching their brother suffer. When it was done, when Lucas was finally dosed with enough of the whiskey medicine to blur the edges of his pain and send him into an exhausted half-sleep, Grant walked to the far side of the room and put his fist through the wall. The violence of it shocked everyone. Jonah gasped, Becky started crying harder, and Hannah just stood there watching as Grant hit the wall again and again until his knuckles were bloody and something in him had been released. "It's my fault," he said, his voice raw and ragged. "I should have fixed that fence last week, should have checked the gate latch, should have been more careful, should have—" His voice broke. "This is what I do. I fail them. I fail everyone." "No," Hannah said firmly, moving toward him. "No, Grant, listen to me. This was an accident. You couldn't have predicted." "I should have!" He rounded on her, and Hannah saw the full force of his anguish, his guilt, his bone-deep terror. "I'm their father. I'm supposed to protect them. But I couldn't save my wife, and now I'm going to lose—" "You're not going to lose him," Hannah interrupted, grabbing his shoulders and making him look at her. "Lucas is going to be fine. We caught it in time. We stopped the bleeding. We set the bones. He's young and strong, and he's going to heal." "You don't know that." "I do know that," Hannah said, and her voice was steel. "Because I'm not going to let anything else happen to him. I'm going to sit by his side every hour of every day until he's better. I'm going to fight for him the same way I fought for Becky, and you're going to help me. You're not failing, Grant. You're here. You're trying. You're loving them as hard as you can. That's not failure. That's all any of us can do." Grant stared at her, and slowly the wildness in his eyes began to recede. He looked at his bloody knuckles, at Lucas unconscious on the table, at his daughters huddled in the corner, at Hannah standing in front of him like a barrier between him and his own guilt. "I can't lose another one," he whispered. "I can't survive it." "You won't have to," Hannah promised. "We're all right here. We're all still breathing, and we're going to stay that way." For 3 days and nights, Hannah kept her promise. She sat beside Lucas while he drifted in and out of feverish sleep, cooling his forehead when he burned too hot, holding his good hand when he cried out in pain, singing softly to him when the nightmares came. Grant spelled her occasionally, insisting she rest, but Hannah could see the toll it was taking on him, the way his hands shook when he checked his son's pulse, the way his face would go gray when Lucas moaned. This was different from Becky's fever. With Becky, the enemy had been invisible, a sickness that had come from nowhere and could be fought with medicine and time. But this injury was visible, concrete, a direct result of the dangerous world they lived in. And it reminded all of them how fragile their existence was, how quickly everything they loved could be taken away. On the fourth morning, Lucas woke with clear eyes and asked for breakfast. The relief was staggering. Hannah felt her knees go weak, felt tears streaming down her face before she could stop them. Grant, who'd been dozing in a chair nearby, jerked awake and was at his son's side in an instant. "Papa?" Lucas's voice was hoarse but steady. "Did I die?" "No, son." Grant's voice was thick with emotion. "You're very much alive." Lucas turned his head slowly and saw Hannah. His eyes, so like his father's, searched her face. "You stayed with me." "Of course I did," Hannah said, trying to smile through her tears. "Like you stayed with Becky." "Yes." Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Mama Hannah?" The name again. The same name Becky had used in her delirium, but this time spoken with full awareness, with choice. "Yes, sweetheart?" Hannah managed. "Did you cry for me?" The question broke her. Hannah thought about lying, about protecting herself, about maintaining some kind of distance. But she couldn't, not with this brave child looking at her with eyes that had seen too much pain. "Yes," she said simply. "I cried a lot." "How come?" "Because I love you. Because somewhere along the way you stopped being someone else's child and became mine. Because the thought of losing you was unbearable. Because you matter to me," Hannah said, echoing what she'd told Becky weeks ago. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of anything bad happening to you." Lucas nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then he looked at his father, and something passed between them, some male understanding that Hannah couldn't quite read. "Papa," Lucas said slowly, "I think we should keep her." Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the exhaustion, Grant laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and genuine, the sound rusty from disuse but beautiful nonetheless. "I think you're right, son," he said. "I think we should definitely keep her." And just like that, something settled. Some question that had been hanging over the household since Hannah first arrived was answered. She wasn't leaving. They weren't letting her go. Whatever this was, this strange, broken, healing family, it was real. As Lucas recovered over the following days, growing stronger and more restless with each passing hour, Hannah found herself thinking about the wildflower field, about Grant's wife resting there, about the promise of spring, about the way grief and hope could exist in the same space. One evening, after the children were asleep and Lucas was propped up in bed reading with his good arm, Grant found Hannah on the porch. She was standing in the cold watching the stars, still wearing the pearl necklace he'd given her. She wore it every day now, a talisman, a reminder that she belonged. "Can't sleep?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Too much on my mind," Hannah admitted. They stood in companionable silence for a while, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not quite. The space between them felt charged with possibility. "I've been thinking about the field," Grant said finally. "The wildflowers." Hannah turned to look at him. "Yes?" "When they bloom, when spring really comes, I'd like to take you there, show you the place, if you still want to see it." "I do want to see it," Hannah said softly. Grant nodded, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said weeks ago." Hannah waited, her heart picking up speed. "When my wife died, I thought I died too. Not literally, but all the parts of me that knew how to be happy, how to hope, how to believe in anything good, they just stopped working. And for almost a year, I've been going through the motions, trying to survive for the children's sake, but not really living." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was raw with honesty. You changed that. You came into this house and you brought something with you, warmth or light, or I don't know what to call it. But suddenly I can breathe again. Suddenly I want to wake up in the morning. Suddenly I can imagine a future that's not just endless gray. Hannah felt her throat tighten. Grant, I'm not saying I love you, he continued quickly. I'm not sure I know how to love anyone that way anymore, but I'm saying I care. I'm saying you matter. I'm saying that somewhere along the way you stopped being the woman I bought and became the woman I... He stopped, searching for words. The woman I need. The woman my children need. The woman this family needs. That's enough, Hannah whispered. You don't have to love me. You don't have to be anything you're not ready to be. But knowing I matter, knowing I'm needed, that's more than I ever thought I'd have. Grant finally turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was open, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. You deserve more than that. Maybe, Hannah said, but I'll take what I can get, because this... She gestured at the house behind them, at the sleeping children inside, at the life they were building together. This is more than I ever dreamed of having. Grant reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and touch the pearls at her throat. His fingers were warm against her skin, and Hannah's breath caught at the intimacy of the gesture. These look right on you, he said quietly, like they were always meant to be yours. Your mother would have wanted them to go to your wife, Hannah pointed out. You are my wife, Grant said, and the words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Maybe not in the way I planned, maybe not in the way either of us expected, but you're here, you're staying, you're raising my children and running my house and holding this family together. If that's not a wife, I don't know what is. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. There's no love in it yet. Yet, Grant echoed, and there was something in his voice, hope maybe, or possibility. But there's care, there's respect, there's gratitude, there's need. Maybe love can grow from that if we give it time. Maybe it can, Hannah agreed. They stood there on the porch as the night deepened around them, not touching except for Grant's fingers still resting against the pearls at Hannah's throat, and Hannah thought about how far she'd come from that snowy night when she'd climbed into a stranger's wagon. How impossible it would have seemed then that she'd be standing here now, wearing a dead woman's necklace and being told she mattered, being told she was needed, being told there might be love waiting somewhere in the future if they were patient enough to find it. Thank you, she said quietly, for telling me, for being honest. Grant's hand dropped from her throat and he stepped back, putting careful distance between them again. We should get inside. It's cold. They went inside together and Grant locked the door behind them. A nightly ritual that Hannah had learned meant safety, meant home, meant another day survived and another night of rest earned. Before they parted to their separate rooms, Grant paused and looked at her one more time. Hannah? Yes? When spring comes, when we go to the wildflower field, I'd like it if you'd stand beside me, not as my housekeeper, not as someone I bought, but as someone who belongs there. Hannah understood what he was asking, what he was offering. I'd be honored. Grant nodded once, sharp and final, then disappeared into his room. And Hannah went to hers, touching the pearls at her throat and thinking about wildflowers and spring and the slow, careful way that broken people learn to heal. In Lucas's room, the boy was still awake, his arm in its splint resting across his chest. When Hannah looked in to check on him, he smiled, a real smile, open and unguarded. Good night, Mama Hannah, he said. And Hannah, who'd spent 18 years being unwanted and another few months being uncertain, smiled back and said, Good night, sweetheart. I'll be right here if you need me. I know, Lucas said. You always are. Simple words, but they held a truth that Hannah wrapped around herself like armor as she finally lay down to sleep. She was here. She was needed. She was becoming loved. And maybe that was the bravest thing of all. Not surviving what life threw at you, but daring to believe you deserved the good things when they finally came. Spring came slowly to Wyoming that year, as if the land itself was reluctant to let go of winter's grip. But it came nonetheless. First in small signs that only those who'd survived the brutal cold could truly appreciate. The icicles that had hung from the eaves began to drip at midday. The snow started to melt in patches, revealing brown grass underneath that would soon turn green, and the air, while still cold, carried a different quality, something softer, something that whispered of possibility. Lucas was healing well, his arms still splinted but his spirits high. He'd taken to following Hannah around the house like a shadow, asking questions about everything she did, offering to help with his good hand, calling her Mama Hannah with an ease that suggested he'd been doing it his whole life. Jonah had started leaving small gifts on Hannah's pillow, pressed flowers, smooth stones from the creek, a drawing of the family that included Hannah standing next to Grant with all three children clustered around them. And Becky had taken to crawling into Hannah's lap whenever she was sitting still, as if she needed the physical reassurance that this woman who'd saved her was real and permanent. Grant watched all of this with an expression Hannah couldn't quite read, something that looked like relief mixed with regret, gratitude mixed with grief. They were careful around each other in those weeks after their conversation on the porch, polite and considerate, neither willing to push for more than the other was ready to give. But there was a new awareness between them, a heightened consciousness of each other's presence that made Hannah's skin prickle whenever Grant entered a room. It was late March when the wildflowers first appeared. Jonah saw them from the kitchen window and let out a cry of delight that brought everyone running. "The flowers! Papa, the flowers are coming!" Grant came in from the barn to see what the commotion was about, and when he saw his daughter's face, bright with joy for the first time in so long, something in his expression softened. He looked at Hannah, and she saw the question in his eyes. "Today?" she asked quietly. "Do we go today?" Grant nodded slowly. "If you're ready." "I'm ready." They set out after lunch, all five of them making the journey to the north pasture. Lucas rode in the wagon despite his protests that he could walk, his arm still bound but healing straight. Becky sat on Hannah's lap, pointing out every bird and cloud and interesting rock as if the world had just been created new for her benefit. Jonah walked beside her father, her hand in his, chattering about the flowers her mother had loved and the crowns they used to make, and the stories about brave plants that grew where nothing else could. The field was exactly as Jonah had described, a wide stretch of land beyond the pasture fence, rolling gently toward distant hills, and covering every inch of it, just beginning to bloom, were wildflowers. Blues and purples and yellows, delicate and fierce at the same time, growing in defiance of the harsh climate that tried to kill them every year. It was breathtaking. Grant stopped at the edge of the field and stood very still, his jaw tight, his eyes suspiciously bright. The children ran ahead immediately, whooping with joy, already gathering blooms to weave into crowns and chains. But Grant remained frozen, and Hannah understood. This was the first time he'd been here since they'd scattered his wife's ashes. The first time he'd allowed himself to return to this place that held so much beauty and so much pain. "You don't have to do this," Hannah said softly. "We can go back." "No." Grant's voice was rough but firm. "I need to do this. I need to—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I need to remember that beautiful things can still exist, that life goes on, that she'd want us to keep living, not just surviving." Hannah waited, letting him take his time, letting him find his courage. After a long moment, Grant took a step forward, then another, and soon they were walking together into the field of flowers, the children's laughter floating back to them on the spring breeze. They found a spot near the center of the field where the flowers grew thickest, and Grant knelt down, his hands hovering over the blooms as if he was afraid to touch them. "This is where we laid her to rest," he said. "Right here. She wanted to be part of this place she loved, wanted to feed the earth that fed the flowers." "It's beautiful," Hannah said, and meant it. "She was beautiful," Grant replied, and there was no bitterness in his voice now, just memory and grief, and acceptance all tangled together. "Inside and out. She made everything better just by being in it, and when she died, I thought nothing would ever be beautiful again." Hannah knelt beside him, careful not to crush any flowers, and waited for him to continue. "But it is beautiful," Grant said, looking around at the field, at his children playing among the blooms, at the wide sky above them. "Life is still beautiful, and I think—" His voice caught. "I think she'd be happy about that." "I think she would be too," Hannah said gently. Grant reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small bouquet of dried flowers, wildflowers preserved from last year, brown and brittle but still recognizable. I kept these, he said, from the last time we came here together, before she got sick. She made a crown and wore it all day, laughing like a girl even though she could barely walk by then. He touched the brittle petals with infinite gentleness. I couldn't let them go. You don't have to, Hannah said. I know. Grant looked at her, and his eyes were full of something that might have been gratitude or might have been grief or might have been both. But I want to. I want to put them back. Let them return to the earth. Let them become part of this place like she is. He paused. Will you help me? Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. Of course. Together they dug a small hole in the earth, careful not to disturb the growing flowers around them. Grant placed the dried bouquet in the hollow, and Hannah covered it with soil, patting it down gently. It was a burial of sorts, a letting go, a way of saying goodbye to the physical remnants while keeping the memory alive. When it was done, Grant sat back on his heels and was quiet for a long time. Hannah stayed beside him, not speaking, just present. The children continued their play nearby, weaving flowers into chains and crowns, their voices carrying across the field like music. I need to tell you something, Grant said finally. Something I've been trying to say for weeks but couldn't find the words. Hannah's heart picked up speed. All right. When I brought you here, to the ranch, to my family, I thought I knew what I was getting. Help, convenience, someone to keep the machinery running while I tried to hold myself together. He shook his head. But you weren't what I expected. You were more. You didn't just keep the house running, you made it a home again. You didn't just watch my children, you loved them. You didn't just tolerate my grief, you helped me carry it. Grant, let me finish, he said, not harshly, but firmly. I told you on the porch that I didn't know if I could love again, that I wasn't sure I remembered how. But I was wrong. He turned to face her fully, and Hannah saw her own reflection in his dark eyes. I do love you, Hannah. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you stayed up 3 nights to save Becky, or maybe when you held Lucas after he was hurt, or maybe it was 100 small moments I didn't even notice. But it happened, and I'm terrified of it, but I can't deny it anymore. Hannah felt like all the air had been stolen from her lungs. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. You don't have to say anything, Grant continued quickly. You don't have to feel the same way. I know this isn't a fairy tale. I'm a widower with 3 children and a failing ranch and more baggage than any person should have to carry. But I needed you to know, needed you to understand that you're not just necessary, you're wanted, you're cherished, you're loved. I love you too, Hannah whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I think I have for weeks now, but I was too afraid to admit it. Afraid you'd see me as trying to replace her. Afraid the children would hate me for it. Afraid I was fooling myself into thinking I could be more than what I was bought to be. Grant reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together the way he had that night on the porch. You were never what you were bought to be. From the moment you arrived, you were becoming something else. Someone we needed. Someone we wanted. Someone we loved. Hannah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than grief or fear or exhaustion. What do we do now? Now? Grant smiled, a real smile, full and genuine, the kind that transformed his whole face. Now we live, we build, we choose each other every day and see where it takes us. Papa, Mama Hannah. Becky came running up, a crown of wildflowers crooked on her blonde hair. Look what we made! Jonah and Lucas were behind her, both wearing crowns of their own, their faces bright with happiness. They'd made extras too, one for Grant and one for Hannah, woven with care from the flowers that grew where their mother rested. These are for you, Jonah said, suddenly shy. She placed one on Hannah's head with careful hands. So you can be part of this. Part of us. Part of Mama's favorite place. Hannah couldn't speak. She could only nod as the crown settled onto her hair, as Grant accepted his own from Lucas with shaking hands, as all 5 of them stood together in the field of wildflowers, with the sun warm on their faces, and the wind carrying the scent of spring. "She'd have liked this," Grant said quietly, and Hannah knew he was talking to his first wife, to the woman whose ashes fed these flowers. "She'd have liked you, Hannah. She'd have been grateful you were here to take care of them when she couldn't." "I hope so," Hannah said. "I know so," Grant replied, and there was certainty in his voice. Then he turned to the children. "Come here, all of you. There's something I want to say." Jonah, Lucas, and Becky gathered close, their faces upturned and expectant. Grant cleared his throat and seemed to be gathering his courage. "Your mama was the best person I ever knew," he began, "and losing her was the hardest thing we've ever had to survive. But we did survive. Because we had each other, and because we remembered what she taught us about being brave and strong and loving." The children nodded, solemn and attentive. "And now we have Hannah," Grant continued. "She came to us when we needed her most, and she didn't just help us survive, she helped us start living again. She's not trying to be your mama, and she never will be. Your mama will always be your mama, and she'll always be part of this family." He paused, his hand tightening around Hannah's. "But Hannah is part of this family too. She's chosen us, and we've chosen her, and I want you all to know that she's going to stay, for good, if she'll have us." Hannah started, but Becky interrupted. "You're staying forever?" the little girl asked, her eyes wide. "Forever," Hannah confirmed. "And you'll be our mama? Our second mama?" Hannah looked at Grant, who nodded his encouragement. Then she looked at Jonah and Lucas, both of whom were watching her with expressions that begged her to say yes, to make it official, to stop being temporary. "Yes," Hannah said, "if that's what you want, I'll be your second mama. I'll love you and care for you and be here for you as long as you need me." "Which is forever," Becky announced with the absolute certainty of a child. "Which is forever," Hannah agreed, laughing through her tears. What happened next felt inevitable, like something that had been building since the moment Hannah first stepped into the Mercer house. The children swarmed her, wrapping their arms around her waist and burying their faces in her skirts, and Hannah held them all close. These brave, wounded children who'd learned to trust again, who'd opened their hearts to someone new without forgetting the mother they'd lost. Grant stood watching for a moment, his own eyes wet, and then he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around all of them, creating a circle of warmth and love and belonging. They stood like that for a long time, a family not built by blood or tradition, but by choice and circumstance, and the stubborn refusal to let grief be the end of their story. When they finally pulled apart, Jonah was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split. "Can we have a wedding, a real one with flowers and everything?" Grant looked at Hannah, the question clear in his eyes. Hannah felt her heart swell with something too big to name. "Yes," she said, "we can have a wedding." The children cheered and immediately started planning. Becky wanted a cake, Lucas wanted to wear his good shirt, Jonah wanted to make flower crowns for everyone. They ran off to pick more blooms, their voices carrying across the field, and Grant and Hannah were left alone again. "A wedding," Grant said, shaking his head in wonder. "I never thought I'd have another one." "Are you sure?" Hannah asked. "We don't have to make it official. We could just—" "No," Grant interrupted firmly. "I want to. I want everyone to know that you're my wife, not because I bought you or because you were convenient, but because I chose you, because I love you, because you're the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." Hannah felt dizzy with joy. "When?" "Soon," Grant said. "As soon as we can arrange it. I don't want to wait anymore. Don't want to waste another day living half a life when we could be living a whole one." They stood together in the field of wildflowers, holding hands, wearing crowns made by children who'd learned to love again. And Hannah thought about the impossible journey that had brought her here. From being sold by an uncle who saw her as a burden, to being bought by a stranger who needed help, to becoming something she'd never imagined possible, loved, wanted, chosen. The wedding was held 3 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon beneath a crooked oak tree that stood at the edge of the wildflower field. It was small, just the family, a handful of neighbors who'd heard the news and wanted to witness it, and the minister from town who'd married Grant to his first wife and seemed moved to be marrying him again. Hannah wore her best dress, cleaned and mended until it looked almost new, with the pearl necklace at her throat and wildflowers woven into her hair. Grant wore his Sunday suit, brushed clean of dust, his hair still damp from washing, his face shaved smooth. The children stood beside them, Jonah holding a bouquet of wildflowers, Lucas trying to stand tall despite his arm still being splinted, Becky bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. The minister spoke about love and commitment and second chances, and his words carried across the field on the spring breeze. But what Hannah would remember most wasn't the ceremony itself. It was the moment when Grant turned to her and spoke his vows. "Hannah," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "you came into my life when everything was dark, and you brought light. You loved my children when you had no reason to love them. You stayed when you could have left. You chose us when we couldn't choose ourselves." He paused, swallowed hard. "I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to love you not because I need you, though I do, but because you deserve to be loved. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, to make sure you never doubt for a single moment that you belong here, with us, forever." Hannah could barely see through her tears as she spoke her own vows. "Grant, when I came here, I thought I was nothing, thought I was just something to be bought and sold and used up. But you showed me I was wrong. You and your children taught me that I had value, that I mattered, that I could be loved." Her voice broke. "I promise to love you and your children for as long as I live. I promise to make this house a home, to fill it with warmth and laughter and hope. I promise to stand beside you in the hard times and celebrate with you in the good times. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your wife. Not because I have to be, but because I choose to be." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Grant he could kiss his bride, Grant cupped Hannah's face in his rough, work-worn hands and kissed her with a gentleness that stole her breath. It was sweet and tender and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, both of them were crying. The children cheered, and the neighbors applauded, and someone started playing a fiddle, and soon there was dancing in the wildflower field, clumsy, joyful dancing that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with celebration. Grant pulled Hannah into his arms and swayed with her in the grass, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," he said quietly, his lips near her ear. "For what?" "For saving us, for loving us, for staying." Hannah pulled back enough to look at him. "Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for giving me a home." "You gave us a home," Grant corrected. "We were just living in a house until you arrived." They danced until the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. The children ran through the flowers until they collapsed, exhausted and happy. The neighbors eventually said their goodbyes and headed back to their own farms. And finally, it was just the five of them again, Grant and Hannah and three children who'd learned that love could grow in the spaces left by loss. As they packed up to head home, Jonah paused at the spot where they'd buried the dried flowers, where Grant's first wife rested. She knelt down and placed a fresh wildflower crown on the grass. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered, "for sending us Hannah, for making sure we'd be okay." Hannah's throat tightened, but Grant squeezed her hand and she understood. This wasn't rejection or replacement. This was a child making peace with the past while embracing the future. This was love that expanded rather than divided, that honored what had been while celebrating what was. They rode home as the stars began to appear, the wagon creaking with familiar sounds, the children drowsy and content. When they reached the house, Grant helped Hannah down from the wagon and held her hand as they walked to the door together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer," he said, and the name sounded right, sounded true. "I've been home for months," Hannah replied. "I just didn't know it yet." Inside, they settled the children into bed, all three of them falling asleep almost immediately, worn out from the day's excitement. Then Grant and Hannah stood in the main room of the house that had become theirs, looking around at the space that had transformed from a tomb into a home. "What happens now?" Hannah asked, echoing the question she'd asked in the flower field weeks ago. "Now we plant a tree," Grant said. "A tree?" He nodded. "My wife and I planted the oak when we first moved here, a symbol of putting down roots, of making this place ours. I think we should plant one too. Something that will grow with us, that will be here long after we're gone, that will remind our children and their children that love can be rebuilt, that families can be remade, that beautiful things can grow from broken soil. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes again, happy tears, grateful tears. What kind of tree? You choose, Grant said. This is your home now, your family, your future. Hannah thought about it for a moment, then smiled. A cottonwood. They grow fast and strong, and their seeds travel on the wind to start new trees wherever they land. They're survivors. Like you, Grant said softly. Like us, Hannah corrected. The next morning, they planted the cottonwood sapling beside the oak tree. It was small and fragile looking, but Hannah knew it would grow tall and strong given time and care. The children helped, their small hands patting dirt around the roots, their voices already making plans for the treehouse they'd build once it was big enough. As they worked, a wagon appeared on the road leading to the ranch. Hannah shielded her eyes against the sun and felt her stomach drop when she recognized the figure driving it. Uncle Silas. Grant must have seen her expression because he immediately moved to her side, placing himself between Hannah and the approaching wagon. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. But Hannah shook her head. "No, this is something I need to face." Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down slowly, his movements careful, his face weathered and tired in a way Hannah didn't remember. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, and Hannah saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Shame. "Hannah," he said, his voice rough. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here." "I'm here," Hannah said, keeping her voice level despite the anger and hurt churning in her chest. "This is my home now." Silas nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I came to—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I came to apologize, and to ask for your forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it." Hannah stared at him, speechless. In all the years she'd lived with him, Silas had never apologized for anything. "I was wrong," he continued, the words seeming to cause him physical pain. "Wrong to treat you the way I did. Wrong to sell you like you were property. Wrong to—" His voice cracked. "You looked just like your mother. Did you know that? Every time I saw you, I saw my sister, and I couldn't bear it. Couldn't bear the reminder that she was gone and I'd failed her by not taking better care of her daughter." Hannah felt Grant's hand on her shoulder, steady and supportive, and she drew strength from it. "That's not an excuse," Silas said quickly. "There's no excuse for what I did. But I want you to understand that it wasn't because you were worthless. It was because I was broken, and I took it out on someone who didn't deserve it." "No, I didn't deserve it," Hannah agreed, her voice strong. "I was a child who'd lost her parents and needed family, and you made me feel like a burden every single day." Silas flinched, but nodded. "I know. And I can't take it back, can't undo the damage. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry, and that I'm glad." He looked around at the house, at Grant and the children, at the tree they'd been planting. "I'm glad you found a real family, people who see your worth." Hannah stood there with her new husband beside her and her children watching from behind her and felt something inside her chest loosen and release. She could hold on to this anger forever, could nurse it and feed it and let it poison her new life. Or she could let it go. Not for Silas's sake, but for her own. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "Not because what you did was okay, but because I won't let it have power over me anymore. I'm choosing to let it go so I can move forward." Silas's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "That's more grace than I deserve." "Yes, it is," Hannah agreed, "but I'm giving it anyway." They stood there for another moment, and then Silas nodded once, climbed back into his wagon, and drove away. Hannah watched him go and felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was free now, truly free. Free from the past, free from the pain, free to be the woman she'd always been meant to be. Grant's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," Hannah said, turning to face him. "I'm home." The weeks that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of a family learning to live together. There were arguments and frustrations, moments of grief that still ambushed them without warning, days when the ghosts of the past felt too present and the weight of survival felt too heavy. But there were more moments of laughter than tears now, more days of hope than despair, more evidence of life returning than death lingering. Lucas's arm healed and came out of its splint, and he celebrated by climbing every tree on the property. Jonah continued her lessons and proved to have a gift for reading, devouring every book they owned, and begging for more. Becky grew like a weed, her vocabulary expanding daily, her questions about the world becoming more complex and harder to answer. And Grant learned to smile again, to laugh without guilt, to hold Hannah's hand in daylight without feeling like he was betraying a memory. He told stories about his first wife sometimes, keeping her alive in the children's hearts, and Hannah listened and added her own observations, helping the children understand that they could love both mothers without choosing between them. On a warm day in early June, Hannah stood in the wildflower field with her hand on her belly, feeling the first flutters of new life growing inside her. She hadn't told Grant yet, had only just become certain herself. But she knew. A child. Their child. A symbol of the family they'd built from broken pieces. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Grant approaching, his expression curious. "You've been standing here for 20 minutes. Everything all right?" Hannah smiled and took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Grant went very still. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, and for a moment no sound came out. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt his shoulders shaking with emotion. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." "Our baby," Hannah confirmed. "A new life, a new beginning." When Grant pulled back, his face was wet with tears, but he was smiling, that full, genuine smile that transformed him completely. "Another Mercer," he said in wonder. "Another child to love." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy?" Grant laughed, the sound joyful and free. "Hannah, I'm beyond happy. I'm grateful. I'm blessed. He stopped, cupped her face in his hands. "I'm so in love with you, it terrifies me sometimes." "Good," Hannah said, grinning, "because I'm terrified too, and I figure as long as we're scared together, we'll be all right." They told the children that night at dinner, and the reaction was everything Hannah could have hoped for. Jonah immediately started planning how she'd help with the baby. Lucas announced he'd teach the baby to ride horses, and Becky simply stated, "I'm going to be the best big sister ever," with the absolute certainty of a child who'd never doubted her own abilities. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Grant and Hannah stood on the porch looking up at the stars. The cottonwood they'd planted was already showing new growth, its leaves rustling in the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Grant asked. "When I brought you here through the storm?" "All the time," Hannah admitted. "I was so scared, so certain I was just trading one kind of misery for another." "And now?" Hannah leaned into him, fitting perfectly against his side. "Now I know that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of the best moments. That storm brought me here. To you, to them, to this life I never knew I could have." "It brought you home," Grant said softly. "Yes," Hannah agreed. "It brought me home." They stood together as the stars wheeled overhead and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers from the distant field. Inside the house, 3 children slept peacefully, their nightmares held at bay by the knowledge that they were loved and safe. And in Hannah's womb, a new life was beginning. A child who would grow up knowing only love, only security, only the certainty that they were wanted. Under the wide Wyoming sky, the Mercer family had learned to live again. They'd taken their grief and their fear and their brokenness and had forged something new from it, something stronger, something that would last. Hannah had come to them as property, as something bought and sold, but she'd become something infinitely more precious. She'd become the heart of a home that had learned to beat again. She'd become the warmth that melted frozen places. She'd become the proof that love could grow in the spaces left by loss. She hadn't been bought after all. She'd been chosen, and she had chosen them right back. And in the end, that choosing, that deliberate, brave, terrifying decision to love and be loved, was what saved them all. The story of Hannah Lee Mercer would be told for generations in that part of Wyoming. The girl who came in winter and brought spring with her. The woman who loved children who weren't hers as fiercely as if they were. The wife who stood in a field of wildflowers and made vows that honored both the past and the future. But Hannah herself never thought of her life as a story. She thought of it as a gift, one she'd almost missed, one she'd almost been too broken to accept, one she was grateful for every single day. And when her daughter was born in late winter, a healthy girl with Hannah's eyes and Grant's stubborn jaw, they named her Hope, because that's what Hannah had brought to the Mercer Ranch. Hope and love, and the courage to believe that broken things could be beautiful again.